Thank you, Senator Cruz. And I just want to comment on the rare earths and other critical minerals. We have them in America. We certainly have them in my state. And by the way, our record on mining them and producing them is much higher in terms of the environmental standards than the Chinese by far. So if we have them, and it's good jobs, and it's important for national security, and we have a strong record on environmental protection on mining them, then we should utilize that. So it's just
and I would say you're absolutely right. In the United States, rare earth minerals aren't that rare.
Yep.
But it's what the Chinese have done is they put our processing plants out of business by subsidized pricing. I mean, because, I agree with you, Senator Cruz, their aim is not just to compete. Their aim is to drive you out of business. Then they can do two things. They can jack up prices and feed that China Inc. kitty where they're going off and doing it to the next sector. Or also, and they're very good at this, it's a strategic pinch point underlying everything. And they've studied, and the one thing I must say it's been great to see in this administration coming in is that when you look at what the work Nazak is doing at Commerce, what we're doing at State, the NSC, in terms of really analyzing strategic pinch points in the supply chain. I don't know if it was ever done before. And then you have to get to a level of specificity where it's like, what's the plant, what's the company, what's the product, and how do we get them over here, or how do we get them in our allies' hands? Ideally, it's in the United States. And you really have to really dig in.
Well, I want to thank Senator Cruz again for his leadership on rare earths and critical minerals, and we're making progress on that in an important way. Let me turn to one final question, Mr. Secretary, Madam Secretary. Both of you, I'd like your comment on this very challenging issue that we've seen really over decades, and that's the temptation, I would call it, by U.S. companies that want to access the Chinese market. And then what ends up happening is that the U.S. companies are either forced to transfer their technology beyond probably what they want to do, or they, in some ways, kowtow to Chinese interests, think the NBA, on broader kind of statements that China finds objectionable. And we have American companies or organizations that start to toe the China line. So it's a dilemma because a lot of this has taken place in decades in the private sector. CEOs making these calls maybe for short-term profit to access the China market, but longer term, in terms of U.S. strategy, it might be undermining our broader strategic goals as a nation. If some of our best companies are selling out their own IPR to gain access to the Chinese market. So what should we as a government, this is beyond just state or commerce, do about this very important issue where our private sector is leveraged to get access to the market of China, but then has to give up things or toe the line on broader issues relating to Taiwan or other things where they're almost forced to make statements that are in line with Chinese Communist Party objectives. I'd like to hear from both of you. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, and then I'll start just to kind of give the economist perspective, right? When you're a company and you have no choice but to deal with Chinese undervalued exports, your only way of survival is actually to go into the Chinese market and benefit from the same distorted cost structures. So what does that ends up happening? I mean, it's you not only have to transfer your technology, but also now you're even flooding the global market more with distorted prices, right? So in many ways, companies, in terms of market access, as you said, or just in order to compete with their own Chinese competitors, have to flock to that market. What's really interesting that I've noticed happening is a few things. China has announced the implementation this year of a corporate credit rating system, kind of like the social credit rating system, where at any time it can ask companies operating in China to hand over their data, most sensitive technology, and their IP. The European Chamber of Commerce has deemed this to be essentially life or death for companies, because if you don't, you will be sanctioned by the Chinese government. I think companies are starting to get spooked. Two, with respect to Huawei, Huawei made some pretty significant threats against Nokia and Ericsson, European companies. But they basically said if Europe is going to ban Huawei from, the EU is going to ban Huawei from its 5G networks, then it's going to put restrictions on the exports of Nokia and Ericsson from China. So now it's causing Nokia and Ericsson to rethink their operations of being
But if I may,
China.
what should we be doing
Yeah.
in terms of government policy? This is mostly taking place in the sphere of the private sector. What should we be doing? I mean, there's one view that we should punish our own companies for doing this. I think that might backfire. What is the government of the United States, the executive branch, view that we should be doing to really, in some ways, give these CEOs backbone not to comply with these demands that we certainly, this goes to reciprocity. We certainly don't do this to Chinese companies, but as government policy, what should we be doing? I need a kind of succinct answer.
Yeah, this is exactly what I was getting at. So if it's cheaper to operate in China, right, to compete with China, then we got to figure out how to give these companies a financial boost so they can now compete if they reshore or offshore into another country. Two, we have to amplify, as the U.S. government, the risks of doing business with China now. Given everything I said with the Chinese threats to companies, European companies and U.S. companies, amplify the risks and give them a way to be cost competitive if they leave China. Thank you.
Mr. Secretary, do you have a view on that? It's a very
Yeah.
important topic. I'm sure you've seen it both in your government position, but also in the private sector.
Yeah, I would make 3 points. You hit on a really, really important issue. And so when I hosted Secretary Pompeo out in Silicon Valley for 4 days at the beginning of the year, one of the things we did, I had dinner in my home in San Francisco. I had like 36 of the top CEOs. I said, guys, we say corporate responsibility, social responsibility. It's also national security, because this is a real and urgent threat to democracy, but it's a real and urgent threat to your companies because they want to put you out of business. Now, the elephant in the room is the retaliation. And so it's all about setting up that bully with your friends behind you. And so if you think of the laws that we put in place in terms of anti-corruption, U.S. company, it's illegal to give a bribe. By the way, we might think of some of the things that where the U.S. companies need to be able to say to China, I can't do that. It's against our law, because they will obey the laws. And
so doing that and getting our allies to do that would give us leverage globally over Chinese practices that we certainly don't want to help promote, but we want to prohibit. But if we do it with our allies, you think that's a leverage point that could start to help on that?
By the way, it's a huge, and this is also one where I might recommend in terms of developing laws like this, collaboration with the private sector, because they'll tell you, because it's got to be, that's got to be crafted just right, because it is a big point. The other thing we do have to do is we have to shine the light on China, yes, but sometimes we have to shine the light on ourselves.
Yep.
And I mean, if you look at what Chinese companies on our American stock exchanges, these are the only companies that don't obey Sarbanes-Oxley and can't get audited. As a guy who's taken 3 companies public, that kind of makes me mad, but that's not the point. The point is it puts our American investors at risk. And by the way, it also creates an unlevel playing field for our companies, because anybody in the business world understands that financial strategy is a key part of your competitive strategy. And this allows them to misstate their earnings, hide subsidized revenue, count things as perpetual revenue versus not. Luckin Coffee is a great example. Lost 300, American investors lost 300 million. So it gives the Chinese company a competitive advantage. The third thing is that it sacrifices the gold standard of our American exchanges. And then the other thing, too, is that the average American bondholder has financed the One Belt, One Way road. And, you know, the emerging index funds, it's all buried in there. And by the way, that's why one of the things that I wrote in an op-ed is that it is incumbent on U.S. companies to disclose who are the financial institutions or who are the Chinese companies they invest into, particularly state pension funds, university endowments, mutual funds. And I think shining that light in terms of disclosure is a great tool, just like reciprocity is a great tool, just like enforcement is a great tool. So we should really use that to the full extent we can, because those concepts are just simple, right on, and easy to understand.
Well, listen, I want to thank you. I know that there's a number of other senators who will be submitting questions for the record here, but I want to thank both the witnesses. I think that, as I mentioned, this is the important beginning of not only laying out the strategy, but the implementation and execution. I believe it's very bipartisan, if you saw from the number of senators, both sides of the aisle, focusing on many of the same concepts. And to both of you, we're hoping that this really starts to begin to establish a policy that can be utilized and implemented for decades, like the containment policy against the Soviet Union that was well regarded, well accepted, and continued throughout administrations. I think we're at the beginning of that moment in our country's history, and I think this hearing is a helpful beginning. So with that, the record will remain open for 2 weeks for this hearing. During this time, senators may submit questions for the record. Upon receipt, we respectfully ask witnesses to submit their written answers as soon as they can back to this committee, but by no later than Friday, August 14th. I want to thank both of our witnesses again for appearing here, for the good work you're doing, for educating the broader American public on these challenges. We have a lot of work to do, but I think we're finally realizing the challenge, and we're off to a good start. With that, this hearing is adjourned.